significant winter storm, including heavy snow and blowing in trees.
Hello and welcome to the Snowbrains podcast, where it's my job to interview the most intelligent people in the snow sports industry and pass their fascinating knowledge on to you, our listeners. I'm your host, Miles Clark. I'm a professional free skier, a professional mountain guide, a UC Berkeley molecular cell biology graduate, the founder and CEO of Snowbrains. And when I was 23 years old, I moved to Squaw Valley in Lake Tahoe, California. On my first day waiting an early morning KT-22 line, I set my skis down to mark my spot on the fourth chair. About 1 minute later, a very famous pro skier walked up, yelled at me for not having my boots on when I put my skis down, a local rule it turned out, and proceeded to grab my skis and throw them out of line down on the cat track below. I calmly walked down, grabbed my skis, put them back in line, pulled my ski boots out of my backpack, put my boots on right there in line. Now, this big pro skier and I were on the same chair. Awkward. Today's Snowbrains podcast is brought to you by Grand Targhee Resort, home to the best snow in Wyoming. Delivering an average of 500 inches of snow annually, you'll find uncrowded slopes and a unique Targhee vibe served on the daily. My guest today is Dr. Russ Costa. Dr. Costa is a cognitive scientist, skier, and mountaineer who studies why people do dumb shit in the mountains. He's an expert on human attention and performance. He is interested in how distracted, fatigued, or otherwise impaired minds and brains perceive the world, particularly in high-risk, high-consequence environments, especially in the mountains and in avalanche terrain. Russ loves to chat about decision-making in avalanche terrain, in the mountains in general, and at high altitudes. Russ's research work utilizes a broad range of methodologies, including electroencephalography to applied behavior analysis in the natural environment. After 2 decades of conducting primarily laboratory-based theoretical work on cognition, Russ has moved parts of his research program outside. So now he's studying cognition and neuroscience in the mountains. His current work examines how hypobaric hypoxia, a lack of oxygen, at high altitude affects human attention, decision-making, and error in the mountains. Russ currently teaches a broad slate of courses in the Honors College and in the neuroscience and psychology programs at Westminster College in Salt Lake City, Utah. Hello, Russ. Welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here. When did you ski last?
Yesterday.
Nice. How many days have you skied this year?
Probably about 10-ish by now.
Nice, man.
12.
Russ, you're a psychologist, and you often study the psychology of how people make decisions in the mountains and in avalanche terrain. So can you please describe to our audience exactly what you study, what you're most interested in, and what your passions are?
For a long time, I've studied, I'd say, impaired brains, not necessarily with drugs and alcohol. In fact, I don't do any work with drugs and alcohol. It's more impaired in that distracted brains. So my dissertation work was on task switching and then a lot of multitasking work. And more that has led, thinking about my own bad decisions in the mountains, to an interest in fatigue and how fatigue brains are impaired actually in a lot of ways that we might expect in a drug or alcohol impaired brain, at least behaviorally see some of the same things. And so, studying rushed brains, distracted brains, fatigue brains is what I do for a while in laboratories. But the last few years, I've been working in the mountains because these qualities, I think, underlie a lot of mountain accidents we see. So that's where my research has taken me. What I do for a living is I'm an associate professor of honors and neuroscience at Westminster College in Salt Lake City here. And the indoor part of my job involves a lot of teaching, particularly neuroscience and also interdisciplinary honors seminars there. But I really like that environment because I've learned to teach to not just neuroscience majors, but to students from all academic backgrounds. And so it gave me that breadth initially. And then more and more, I've been speaking to public audiences at snow and avalanche workshops or other educational events. And I really like communicating that scientific information to general audiences in ways that I think maybe one of the biggest failings of science is that it's not it hasn't been excellent at necessarily communicating itself to the public outside of itself. Scientists are trying to write journal articles to be read by scientists studying what they do.
We don't read medical journals.
Yeah. And so I think it's been really interesting to bring my work in neuroscience, because I've written papers for those journals and can read those journals. And it's part of my training to particularly do electroencephalography work. And so I study brain waves, the electrical activity produced by brains, and I can read those papers, but I really like communicating that, for particularly how it applies in the mountains. I've been, throughout my career in the mountains, been impacted by many accidents, including avalanche and otherwise. And what can we do to minimize them? I don't think there's ever going to be a way to eliminate all accidents. Mountains are dangerous places, and there's just objective hazard we can never zero out. But I do think we can minimize accidents and reduce them. And so kind of applying the science to this field's been an exciting path I've been on for the last 6 or 8 years.
I love it. And when I talked to you earlier, you said a lot of what I study is why people do dumb shit in the mountains.
Yeah. Yeah. That's my the fast intro. I gave you the longer one, but
yeah, that's good. That's your tagline now.
Yeah, it's. I guess I've studied why people do dumb shit for a long time, but it's been now in the mountains.
Yeah. It's evolving. I love that. Well, to start, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background in the mountains?
So, I mean, the mountains have been a pull factor to move me a lot of where I've gone and throughout my life. I grew up in just south of Boston, between Boston and Providence, but thankfully, family would take us to the mountains occasionally for camping and skiing and such. And do my undergraduate work in Vermont at Middlebury College, and sort of was drawn to the mountains to get out of the suburbs of Boston at the time. So I found myself right out of college moving to Utah, moving to Alta, again pulled toward bigger mountains.
Yes,
and started skiing in the backcountry that first winter. Not a lot. I was at that point sort of 99% resort skier, but bought my first transceiver and bought first set of spare skins and started learning it. And then more and more, I've been just skiing in the mountains and mountaineering. And my research has taken me to even bigger mountains now, trying to do high altitude research work. We can talk about that later. And it's been great.
That is great. And that's cool. I graduated college in 2001. So that's when I started my mountain education. So we're probably about the same age, around 43 years old. So that's great. I like that. And how many days do you ski per year with all your academic work? How many days are you able to get in a year?
It varies quite a bit. It's hard to average it out. I've generally said 50 because it's easy math. And that's it, by the way, a heuristic. We'll talk about that later. We tend to just think of the easiest solution. So 20 years times 50, I can roughly estimate 1,000 backcountry days. Now that I'm older, it's easier to get injured. And those 6-week injuries have turned into 6-month injuries. And so depending on injury and work schedule has varied a lot throughout my career, but I'd like to say 50 plus.
That's great.
Good years, maybe twice that much, but when I'm injured and stuff, a lot less.
Yeah, well, and considering what you do for a living, that's very impressive. So let's start with something you study and speak to a lot, and that's decision fatigue. So yeah, to start this off, please tell us, what is decision fatigue? So decision fatigue is a theory that's come out of psychology, I think specifically social psychology, but been embraced by a broader audience in the field. And it's the theory that as we make more and more decisions, the quality of those decisions deteriorates over a day. It's an interesting theory because it suggests that decision-making is hard. And we know that we're working hard when we're on our 10th lap of the day or when our partners are moving at a really quick pace, because we can feel that fatigue in our lungs or in our legs. We're not as good at feeling that mental fatigue, but research work has shown that decision quality does deteriorate. And it's something that I think it's very dangerous to backcountry travelers because we're unaware of that fatigue setting in. Mallory, I think, has said it's hard for the stupid brain to know it's being stupid because the apparatus we have for detecting our being stupid is impaired. It's also being stupid. So how would you say that decision fatigue affects skiers and riders when they're in avalanche terrain?
I think it basically means that our decision making probably deteriorates over the course of a day. And we're sharper decision makers and making better decisions on that first lap than as opposed to the eighth. And I think it counteracts other factors that as we ski, as particularly for making the same lap on the same slope more and more often, that's building confidence in that slope, rightfully or wrongfully, depends on whether it's a persistent weak layer or not, right? And so as our confidence is increasing, our decision ability is decreasing, our decision quality is decreasing. And that's a dangerous pattern to exist in the mountains to almost every touring party out there. And it's something I've probably done many times without really noticing.
That is a fierce juxtaposition of things. You're because it is true. You've been out there. Oh, we skied a couple runs. No avalanches happen. I haven't seen any problems. And so your confidence is building. But if you're getting tired, which you are in the backcountry, because every time you hike up, it's a long hike. So your confidence is building, but your decision-making is getting worse, which makes me think the next question is kind of, how often do you think decision fatigue is to blame in mountain accidents and avalanche accidents?
I don't know about decision fatigue specifically.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly, I think decision-making errors exist in almost all of them.
I think that's right.
So every accident to some level involves a decision to go out that day. But from there, we can look at chains of errors that it can deteriorate over time, the decisions made throughout the day.
Absolutely. And, it brings me to, one of my next points is I have a quick list here of 4 critical elements that I'm guessing decision fatigue affects in the mountains. And it's deciphering slope angle, uphill route selection, choosing what to ski and ride, and red flags. So I'm curious to hear your perspective on how you think decision fatigue and decisions affect all these attributes.
Yeah, one of the problems I think, or limitations so far in how psychology work has been applied in the snow and avalanche world has been it jumped right to decision making. And I'm not a decision making researcher. Actually, I came from a background of studying perception, attention, and particularly attention and task switching and multitasking and those kind of brains. But everyone wanted to know about decision making because that seemed to be the point where the errors were made.
Right.
But any decision we make involves hundreds or thousands of inputs that go into that decision, mm-hmm. including perception at the very basic, and then sort of what we perceive about the environment, how we process that perception, let's say, and then what we choose to attend to in the environment. Memory plays a role, what we remember from. And all these factors lead into our decisions, in addition to any social factors of who we want to impress and how tempting the powder looks and all that.
Oh, yeah.
But some of those, and so when we talk about decision making, we're kind of already talking at a level of hundreds of other things going on. And I've been interested in moving the conversation to a lower level, in particular for something like perception.
Right.
How do we see the world differently, depending on how tired we are? And actually research by colleagues at the U we've chatted about a lot lately have suggested this is exactly what happens, that as we get more and more tired, distances look longer. Slopes can look steeper, et cetera, and it changes the way we perceive the world. And so fatigue, not even psychological fatigue that comes with making many, many, many decisions, but just simple physical fatigue impacts the way we see the world. And if those perceptions are forming the very basis of our decisions in the mountains, and we can show they're biased, it opens up a whole chain to look at and how we get to erroneous decisions in avalanche terrain, other high-risk environments.
Well, and that's fascinating. If you're saying as we get more tired, we might see distances as longer and slopes as steeper. And I'm almost kind of hoping on a basic level that maybe that helps us make more conservative decisions when we are tired. Do you ever see anything around that?
Yeah, well, that's probably the reason they evolved in our species, right?
Yeah, because I feel like I do that. I'm like, hey, they're like, let's do another lab. It's like, man, I am tired. I'm going home.
Yeah.
That looks hard.
And although I said earlier, it's hard for a tired brain to recognize it's become tired.
Right.
And the brain has no pain sensors, right? So you can't have a brain that actually hurts.
Which is a good thing. Sounds good to me.
But maybe tired lungs or tired legs save us from making dumb decisions. And it's kind of a nice warning factor. And, when you start to get tired, realize that it's just not your legs hurting. It's your brain's probably also not doing as good as your legs were a few laps ago.
and do you think there's a one-to-one correlation there? That does a tired body mean a tired brain? So if I get really tired, I can it'd be nice to say it. Well, my brain is probably tired here too, which means my decisions are going to be great. I should probably back off.
I don't think it's a one-to-one correspondence. And one thing I'm really interested in research, although I don't have any definitive results I can really talk about, and it's a tough problem to study, is how expert brains might tire less quickly than a novice brain.
Oh, interesting.
Part of this is just simply back to our concept of decision fatigue, not even that experts make better decisions than novices, but that experts use less mental energy to make decisions than novices do. And that goes from everything from perceiving the world to attention to recalling memories about that. And there's a lot of evidence that actually not only do expert decisions get faster and more accurate, and this is from cognitive neuroscience laboratories, they also show less activity in parts of the cortex, particularly the frontal lobes, that are responsible for the really hard thinking we do. It could be that expert brains sort of are more fit, if you will, or use less resources in the early parts of the tour when they don't need to be used to be reserved in that way.
And that makes sense. And so, somebody who is an expert is just going to have, and it's just not going to take as much energy to process all the input maybe and get to that decision each time, where somebody new, everything's quite new and exciting and they're using more brain power. Yeah. Let's take one step back, because I love this idea of, I think I found this really interesting in your studies, how experts versus novices make decisions differently and why. Can you walk us through that ideology?
Yeah, I mean, the easy why is that they've been doing it longer, right? They have more practice, more repetitions, and they've just sort of improved. And that goes everything to physical aspects and subtle motor things. We can never be like consciously, we call this implicit memories. We can never consciously describe, like how to weight skins on different slopes, steep angles, and all steepness angles, and also different surface conditions. Eventually, you just kind of know how much weight to put on, but early in your career, slipping more, and that's just simple motor touch. And that scales all the way up with just experts have so much more time in the environment, or I think are often learning in implicit ways they're not aware of. And so the experts themselves couldn't tell you why, even when it comes to decision making and recognizing signs of danger. So Drew Hardesty, the Utah Avalanche Forecast Center, I've had numerous conversations, and others in the avalanche community are very interested in this idea of expert intuition, that somehow experts just have feelings, or they'll describe a feeling about the world that's better, that they're able to recognize that something a novice wouldn't. And the famous stories that's come from Danny Kahneman's research with Gary Klein on firefighters, and they'll be on a scene, and then suddenly an expert firefighter will note, like, it's not safe, like, let's get out now. And then the floor breaks through on everyone. And when interviewed later, they said, I couldn't tell you what was wrong, but it was. And it's that intuitive sense that saved lives. And they're unable to explain exactly what that perception was. And that makes it difficult. What Drew and I have talked about is, if that sense is pushing you toward conservatism, like, let's get out of here, like that, do it, follow it. But if it's pushing you the other way of, I'm feeling this is just going to ski great, I got a feeling this is going to, don't go that way and increasing more risk. And so that's my kind of general rule. But I like to credit Drew Hardesty for that. He calls it the one-way street of intuition.
I like that, and I don't know if I'm being too bold here to call intuition sort of a gut feeling is what I think a lot of the public talks about, your gut feeling. And I don't want to open Pandora's box here, but I've done a little bit of research or maybe just reading about how a lot of times your subconscious has so much to do with your decision making, and it's actually perceiving things that you aren't consciously perceiving. And that's why I've been told and I've read, always try to listen to your gut when it's pushing you in the conservative direction. And I agree. You don't need to listen to your gut if it's saying, send it, dude, because that could always go the wrong way. Being more aggressive is not always the right call. And more often than not is not the right call. But when your gut is giving you a conservative red flag, I do think that is something to listen to. So it's cool to see that you guys are seeing it in this realm as well. How can we recognize decision fatigue in ourselves and in our partners? And once recognized, what can we do to fix it?
In the aviation world, I think they refer to this as monitoring. I'm told that in the old, and this is commercial aviation, that there would be a pilot and a co-pilot, but one person would be on flying the plane and the other would be off. And they've moved that to one person is on flying the aircraft and the other person is monitoring. So one way to think about this is to monitor your partners. And when I'm in mountain environments, I'm often doing this to see if the tip of the nose has frostbite on it or things of that nature, but it's physical monitoring, but monitor their decision-making as well. And they're simply the way they're talking, the way they're moving. My best partners, I have a thing that I don't eat enough in the mountains. They monitor my intake. Like, Russ, have you been eating?
That's good.
Eat some more food. And so, and just extend that monitoring to more than just looking for frostbite, and how fast they're moving, but to continue monitoring their sort of mental state, because it is hard doing yourself. I've sometimes caught myself doing something really dumb but it's hard because as you start to get tired, you notice those things less and you kind of just stop caring even sometimes because you're too tired to care. And so I think having good partners and monitoring is my top solution.
I like that a lot. I think that our listeners can really take that home is monitor your partners and do your best to monitor yourself, of course. But that's not always effective, as we're talking about, because it's you and you're not able to see yourself that well. But monitoring your partners, might even be a little conversation like, hey, let's make sure we monitor each other when we're out here, keep an eye on each other. And especially as you get towards the end of the day, as you get more tired, as decisions or anytime decisions become critical, I think that makes a ton of sense. Hey, let's keep an eye on each other. Make sure that I'm on top of it. I'll try to make sure you're on top of it.
But it comes down, and I think it comes down to little things too. Make sure people are eating and drinking, certainly warm, and the things we often don't think about because it's easy to just like keep an eye on people from doing really dumb things, but
the basics
and know your partners well, because it's good. It's easy to see when someone changes. And I've noticed this in high altitude, even not that high, like Mount Rainier or something at 14, but climbing with people from sea level when I'm like, something just changed about their speech and other things. And so I'm used to doing that altitude, but the more I think about, the more we should just be doing that all the time, even if altitude's not a concern. Just monitor to make sure your partners aren't getting totally tired and fatigued, because that's going to affect their decision making.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think making sure you're hydrated, make sure you're getting food in, especially, we try to, when I'm guiding, we say we stop every hour. So every hour, get in like 100 calories, make sure you have a little bit something to drink, put on sunscreen, all these things can hugely affect us on the mountains. And like you're saying, if we don't take care of ourselves like that, it is going to affect our brains. It is going to affect our decision making.
Also sleep the night before,
yes.
things like that impact. And I've a lot of people ski before work these days on very little sleep. And sometimes I wonder when I've done really dumb things in the morning, if it was like, because I slept 4 hours, went to bed at midnight and woke up at 4. And
oh man, for sure. I just read that book, Why We Sleep. And I forget the author right now. I apologize, but I highly recommend that to our listeners. Why We Sleep changed everything. Because we all, especially mountain people, we will sacrifice sleep to get into the mountains. And it's not always the best call. Sometimes you have to do it, but when you don't have to, don't do it, because sleep is everything.
And sometimes you're just spending a night in the mountains when it's just not possible to sleep because the wind is ripping or it's freezing cold or
or the elevation.
But I think that's the thing about learning how to be in the mountains is you need to learn how you perform in those environments, and to be aware that, hey, if you had a poor night of sleep for whatever reason, that's going to impact your decision making, and maybe it's time to back off a little bit too.
Hugely. And, the other thing I thought really impacted me when I was, reading some of your lectures and watching some of your videos is, the brain is 2% of our body mass, and it uses about 20% of our oxygen. And I've read other places, I think the brain uses about 20% of your calories each day. So that's a fifth of, the food and oxygen they're taking in days just go into your brain. So you can imagine how important that thing is, how much as it uses and how much as it needs to sustain itself on a high level.
And when you get calorie depleted or sleep the other, how is your decision making going to go downhill in the same way that your muscle strength goes down when your muscles are worn out? This is something that's using 20-25% of your calories, your oxygen.
Insane.
And if you don't have enough calories, it's not just going to be your muscles that hurt, right? Your decision making is going to fall off the cliff.
Huge to think about, because we all do. I mean, I went backcountry skiing today, just an hour and a half, but I didn't eat anything. And, that's not the smartest thing to do. Luckily I was in a safe area, just skied the groomer at Alta, but, making sure you stay on top of things, because especially what I think what happens is we don't take good care of ourselves, and then something goes wrong, or something small goes wrong, which leads to something else small going wrong. And then all of a sudden you're in a bad situation. You haven't been taking good care of yourself. Your decision-making is not going to be strong. Let's jump into what can we do about decision fatigue? So there is, some strategy here. And I was reading this on your work about talking about pre-trip, during trip, and post-trip strategies to avoid making bad decisions out there. And could you go through this for us?
We've already been talking about a lot you can do, and eat, hydrate, right? Make sure you have enough calories, enough water, preferably have enough sleep the night before. And that sets you up well. But some of the other things, at least from a pre-trip avoidance wise, having pre-trip checklists.
Yes.
Back to the decision fatigue topic. One of the findings from that, and somehow this got tied to Obama in a piece. Thanks, Obama. But
it's involved in everything, man.
No, it's like something about had chosen what suit he would wear the day before, so we didn't have to make that decision morning. But I think that's a longer, an older use practice in business.
Right.
And it's to stop from don't make that decision in the morning. You need your decision capacity, because it's a limited capacity resource you have to be spent on more important decisions. And skiers make a different set of decisions there, but to have everything ready in the morning so you don't need to decide even not just what clothing you're wearing, and just to minimize the amount of decisions you have to make before you get into the high risk environment. And that's one of the many benefits of having a pre-trip plan well set up. What time are we meeting? What am I bringing? All that. Because then by the time you get to the trailhead, and maybe, it's a trailhead where it's a long approach, by the time you get into avalanche terrain, you haven't had to make a lot of decisions yet before you have to start making those really critical ones. And so it's checklists help this, because the checklist makes the decisions for you. You don't need to think about that.
I love that. I love having my bag packed the day before. Because I feel like in the evening I'm relaxed. I can kind of go through it. I can take my time. There's no rush. And you can have that checklist and go through, all right, I got my beacon, probe, shovel, food, sunscreen, all the things that I need to have. Everything I've got ready to go, boom. And a lot of times, you pack early and frantic in the morning, and you're trying to make a certain time to meet somebody, and you forget something critical.
Yeah, there's a couple reasons that happens. And because I was looking at forward-looking from that example, even if nothing goes, if you don't forget anything or whatever, just having everything together in the morning means you don't have to spend time using not just time to find it, but also energy running through the mental search of, did I pack this or that, or where did I put this?
Right.
And that's more, you asked how to avoid decision fatigue. That's more energy you'll have for later when you have to make that decision from the ridgeline or summit.
Almost thinking about it like you have a finite amount of good decisions per day. And so let's not waste some of those in the morning when we're just packing our damn bag.
Absolutely. That's I think that's advised to business people as well. So, make decision what suit you're wearing before.
So that was pre-trip. So let's talk about during trip. The notes I got from you are, so during the trip, there's communication, crowdsourcing info, slow down, use decision points, and hydrate and eat. And so, can you speak to some of those? during trip?
So the pre-trip checklist was something that worked, and sort of during trip, the hydration during the trip and monitoring there. Communication is another big one.
Huge.
And so that's just for safety in general, but also sharing observations helps to increase your perception through that communication instead of just your eyes, your ears, your body that was sort of experiencing the ascent. What did your partners think, and maximize that benefit through communication? Now you're sort of crowdsourcing your observations. And that's another important, I think, or during trip thing to do as you get to those big decision points.
And I feel like that's huge because that happens to me all the time, that somebody in the group notices something critical that the others haven't. And if we weren't communicating, that wouldn't have happened. So, hey, I just saw a shooting crack over there. I just heard a whoomp. Did you? No. Let's talk about it. And let's make a new plan. Let's make a new decision. And then I like also how you talk about slow down. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, just to back up a point, your last point about that's the model used by, or looking at somebody notices something and doesn't say something, the problem you observe. That's been noticed in aviation accidents,
right?
Medical accidents, surgeries and such. And so those professional organizations and those jobs have lots of training into sort of how to avoid that type of error. And one of the things we're trying to do in education efforts is move those kind of what they do in aviation and what they do in professional medical settings to backcountry touring parties, even recreational touring parties, to improve that safety margin.
Makes a ton of sense.
Yeah. And because pilots are good at it. Doctors are good at it. Nurses are good at it. Recreational ski tours, there's some variability there, right?
Oh yeah, there's so many, all the hubris and all the issues that we all have, being macho and trying to be tough and just power through things. And I don't want to bring up a problem. Let's just keep rolling. And that has not been helping us at all. So I think that us backcountry skiers need to get a lot better about communicating. And I love the idea of crowdsourcing information within your group.
Being rushed is another time we know humans make errors. And we've known this, we being cognitive psychologists have known this for a long time. Simply asking someone to do something faster in a reaction time test, they can speed up, but they're going to make more mistakes and make more errors. And that's what we call the speed accuracy trade-off. Uh-huh. There might be a time when you're willing to accept a little more risk, a little more margin for mistakes and errors for that speed, because maybe the speed is on your side for safety. But for the most part, don't rush and slow down. And a lot of things we've talked about, communication and that crowdsourcing, that takes time. Yes. And you have to slow down and maybe not stop, but you slow down to a pace where you can talk. And there's definitely been times when, I've wanted to say things and it's just been like, well, I might as well just save my energy. And it's too complex a point about the snow I want to make, and I can't have this conversation right now.
Right.
Too tired. And so that does require slowing down, and that comes with costs as well. Like you might get stuck behind the red snake.
And that's, relative to what, your life and limb, that's a relatively small consequence. So I think that we all need to take that in perspective. And to your point, being rushed makes us make more errors. We all know that's the case. We all do that almost on a daily basis. My very first ski run of the year here, I think it was November 2nd. I ran up to get to the top of Main Chute on Mount Baldy in a little bit of a storm. And I got to the top, and these two skimo guys in spandex and no backpack show up. And they're just ripped their skins off about to go. So I said, hey, do you mind if I go first? I really wanted to be the first one because it was fresh snow. And so I'm scrambling to get ready. I get ready really fast as I can. And I drop in, and about 3 turns in, my right ski just explodes off and goes flying, and I crash, and it's hilarious. And I'm pretty sure, looking back, it's because I was rushed and I didn't lock that out. I didn't pull the tab up on my Dynafit binding to make sure that it was tight. It was just at the loosest setting. So making these kind of mistakes can have consequence. Luckily for me, I just fell over. It was no big deal. My ski didn't go too far. But then I always think back to the Teton AT guys, Steve Romeo and his partner, I forget his name right now. They were rushed doing a backcountry tour in the Grand Teton National Park a handful of years ago because one of their fathers was flying in and they needed to pick him up at the Jackson Airport. And they made a shortcut. They did something wrong. They were rushed. They ended up in a huge avalanche that I think normally they would not have been in that zone. and they both perished. And that's so sad. And, the consequence on the other side was just that your dad had to wait a little longer, which is not so bad. So that rushing in the mountains really has true consequence that we need to all be aware of. Another one of the points here during your trip was using decision points throughout the day to communicate with partners. Could you speak to that a little bit? I think that's a great idea that we don't do enough.
During a ski tour, there are certain times where you're going to stop. Oftentimes it's a ridge or it's a summit sometimes, and you do need to transition there. But in addition to just thinking the physical terrain features where you should stop or where you shouldn't stop, right? Depends the slopes above you. To think about when in that tour is there a critical decision point. Of course, the decision to ascend is going to always be a critical decision point, but there are others about if there's multiple skin tracks or multiple potential ways to attain a ridge. Do we go to up the one on the left or up the one on the right?
Right.
And to stop and talk about that with your partners. A couple of years ago, we were skiing out in the Stansberries in the twin couloirs there off of Desert Peak. And there's twin couloirs, and we got to them and they look pretty much the same, and made the decision to go up the left one. And part of it was because there was a cornice overhanging the rocks on the right. It was one of those early spring mornings, mid-spring mornings, but early morning when the sun was hitting that for the first time after a new storm. And the whole cornice comes down and down the couloir on the right, as we're probably 2/3 of the way up the one on the left. And
whoa.
Yeah, it wasn't even that hard of a decision though. But I never really communicated that. I just sort of said, no, we're going up the one on the left. And I never really communicated that to the partner I was with that day, but why? But
yeah, that would have been a great thing to talk about.
But I should have shared that. And I did look at it and the overhang, and it's just one of those decision points that I think when you hit that, why didn't I stop to talk about it?
Yes.
And why didn't we communicate to the team? And so these places you need to stop should not just be physical places of where at the top of the climb we need to take the skins off. But if there's a place you need to make a critical decision, that's a good time to stop and communicate, provided it's in a safe place. You don't necessarily need to have these conversations if you're at risk to avalanche or cornice or everything overhead.
I think that's great. And I'm trying to get better about communicating with my partners more, even when I don't really have anything to communicate. I sometimes just check in like, hey, how you feeling? Does everything feel good here? Any ideas, any questions, comments, ideas? And so I think just being more communicative is going to be great for all of us backcountry travels, especially in avalanche terrain. And when he was referring to the Stansbury Mountains as a remote mountain range in western Utah, kind of in the desert, it's a pretty cool area. So that was during the trip. Let's hit post-trip. So what are the best things to do post-trip? At this point, you're not really decision-making anymore, but there's still some good ideas, some good practices here.
Yeah. And I think one other question I get a lot of, I'm just asking the questions for myself now. Just kidding.
That's easier. It makes my job easy.
Yeah, it's how to become a better decision maker.
Right.
And one of the ways I think we do that is with effective debriefing. By at the end of our day, reflecting on the decisions we made throughout that day. And that's a way to get better at it. Not just going out there and making decisions, but then to go back and think what went well today, what didn't go well, what could we done better, were there any places we're uncomfortable. There's lots of different ways to go through a debriefing. But I think the other benefit is it improves your decision-making into the future. It also gets help you understand your partners a lot better, particularly if you're sort of building a newer relationship with a backcountry partner.
Yeah. And I feel like you can build some good boundaries there too. Like, hey, that went bad. I don't want to ever be in a situation like that. Or, hey, that was great. Let's figure out how to make that happen more often. I think that's perfect point. On all sides too. Sometimes the boundaries are like, I don't want to ski with this person again because their response is way too high. Other times it might be more if we ski again, then we need to choose mellower terrain because they were uncomfortable, and it comes into sort of deciding where everyone's going to be happy the next day. But it's more about happiness, more than about who's happiest, right? It's about safety right now. Yes.
And my debriefing, I've actually sometimes you get too caught up in what went well today. We skied out some powder, great ski line. We're all back to the car okay, with no one died, no one got injured. And then what didn't go well today? Trail breaking sucked, right? Whatever. So I've just skipped all the what went well today stuff and just asked a simple question. It's like, when were we at the most risk today?
Great question.
And that's it. And it's simple. It's easy to remember. And the reason I do that, though, is it also forces us to look at our vulnerability. Mm-hmm. Like, when was I at the most risk? And it gets away from that, everything went well today. And that kind of cuts the learning off there. Just repeat and do again.
Right.
But you can always find something you wish that you should have done better. And I think asking that, particularly about risk, has helped me sort of fine tune my behavior in the mountains. And I still have a long way to go.
I am going to remember that. That's huge. I love asking that. When were we the most vulnerable today? When we were most at risk today? Because it's so easy. I think part of how the human brain is designed is you just remember the great stuff. And a lot of times you forget the bad things. You go on a trip and you don't remember the suffering and the long slogs. You remember, wow, that run was so great. Let's do it again. But I think that's key. Let's push that stuff aside just for now. We get back to the car. Let's ask, hey, where were we most at risk today? What could we have done better? I love that. So that's a point I'm really going to take home. I hope our listeners take home. There's a lot of good points in here in the pre-trip, during trip, and post-trip. But I love that debrief. And I think that's something a lot of us skip. It's right to, hey, I got some beers in the snow right here. And then let's just talk about how fun that was and how rad we are. But I really think that we should take a moment to think about, all right, where were we most at risk today?
I'm glad you brought up beers in the snow, because it reminds me of a quote by Blaise Reardon, and he wrote a piece for the Avalanche Review 5 to 8 years ago. And when he recommended the briefing, I think it was something to the effect of make your debriefing more than just toasting beers at the end of your day.
Yes.
And I think that's too often what briefing becomes, although that's definitely a great way to end a day, right?
It is, but you can do both, right? Because I think that part of the macho culture of the mountains is we get a beer, we cheers afterwards, and we don't talk about anything that went wrong. We just talk about what was rad. And that's part of the macho thing. Like, don't complain, don't bring up anything bad. But I do think that's good. Like, hey, we should be thinking on the ideology of how can we do this better? And I really like that mentality. So a synopsis here is we make mistakes in the mountains when we're distracted, when we're rushed, when we're fatigued. And I think that's a really interesting segue into the pandemic. How do you think because the pandemic has us distracted, it's got us rushed, it's got us fatigued without even going into the mountains before we even get there. How do you think the pandemic has affected people's decision-making in the mountains?
The first decision is always to go to the mountains.
Right.
And it's put more people in the mountains. It's put more people in avalanche terrain. That was a trend that was naturally happening for a long time. I was one of those people 20 years ago.
Me too.
But it exploded because the resorts closed. And I think back to that weekend. It was the end of my spring break, a reasonably stable snowpack. At least by that point in that snowpack, the persistent weak deep layers had largely calmed down. Everyone was stoked to get out.
Yes.
And there were storms on the horizon, a good weather window in late March into early April. It was looking like we had a couple of storms lined up. Yeah, it was just a time when everyone was excited to get out. And there'd been a slow increase in people, buying more touring gear, buying avalanche transceivers, taking avalanche courses. But the skiing was so good at the resort, people were still largely skiing the resort. And then the pandemic hits and the resort shuts down and it dumps.
Of course.
And it's crazy.
Of course.
And so, yeah, everything was different that weekend. I think it was also one of those storms that came in on a Friday. A lot of people didn't have to go into work anymore. It was, and all of these things, we haven't even talked about snow yet, other than the fact that it was snowing as an attractor that drew people into the mountains, into the backcountry. And I think some of that was the result we saw, which is a lot of people caught and carried. Thankfully, no one killed. was just more people out.
Right.
And because the resorts were closed, and that meant in the crowded and relatively small mountain range we are in the Wasatch, lots of people on the skin tracks above each other. And it was an interesting and to be honest, quite scary time. Even though the snow was mostly stable, it was just new snow problems that were sort of happening.
Yeah. I mean, of course, then you get the problem of just too many people in one place, which always creates problems in the backcountry.
Well, there were other problems though, right? Because that one place was Alta ski area. Primarily, I mean, people were at the other ski areas too, but for whatever, I was across the street on the Emma Ridges, I had binoculars with me, and I was just watching that sort of the conga line go up corkscrew and thinking about that.
Today's Snowbrains podcast is brought to you by Grand Targhee. With good times served daily at Grand Targhee Resort, it's time to embrace the vibe. Escape the crowds and get back to enjoying skiing and snowboarding the way it was meant to be. From our family-friendly kids adventure zone and uncrowded runs to the wide open terrain for all abilities, the big mountain feel and western charm makes Grand Targhee a must-visit winter destination. And that's a great segue into what I want to talk about next is heuristics. And one of the things is the facets heuristics, which is an acronym FACETS. So before we get started, let's just define heuristic. It's a weird word. Basically means a mental shortcut that might help people solve problems, make judgments more quickly, more efficiently. But they can also be a crutch. So it can be a two-sided blade here. So as we get more tired, we run out of mental energy. We rely on heuristics sometimes instead of doing a full analysis. So I'm curious to hear you speak to that, and then we can kind of go through the acronym. But yeah, do you think that's kind of part of it? As we get tired, we run out of energy in our minds and our brains, and we start to rely on heuristics instead of really analyzing what's going on.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things we see with why the reason I talk about being distracted so much, because we don't have enough free mental resources, and kind of think of like when you have way too much going on your way too many windows open on your computer screen, right? And use the shortcut. That's when you use the shortcut. Mm-hmm. When we're really rushed, heuristics are fast relative to that slow thought. When Daniel Kahneman, who I've referenced before, but talks in much of his research work, and including his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, about two systems, system one thought and system two thought. With system one thought being more instinctual and habitual, but not using the human brain. And system one thought is really fast and really easy, doesn't use a lot of effort. And so when we're rushed, we need a fast decision. We use the heuristic. And when we're fatigued, we need an easy decision that doesn't take a lot of effort. We've talked about decision fatigue, right? We rely on that system one thought. We rely on those heuristics because they require so much less energy than that system two thought would. That's much slower.
That makes a ton of sense. And so I think it's something for us to remember. Heuristics are helpful, but we don't want to be rushed and use them as a crutch, use them in place of actually taking in all the data and taking the time to make a good decision. And so facets is FACETS. And facets, of course, is something in the snowpack. It's when crystals get large and have low density, and that can create a weak layer in a snowpack, and that can really contribute to avalanches. So that's why this is a great acronym. So let's just start with the first one. It's familiarity, acceptance, consistency, experts, tracks/scarcity, and social facilitation. And so you kind of brushed on familiarity just now, but let's hit it one more time. Could you walk us through familiarity?
Yeah, so familiarity is the really a reliance on memory, in particular, sort of the easiestly accessible memories to make decisions. Because cognitively assessing a snowpack and sort of takes a lot of time and effort, you could judge its stability by the last time you were there. Maybe it was last week or last 2 weeks ago or last season, and it was stable then. So why wouldn't it be stable now? And that logic, of course, seems silly But when you're really tired or we've been talking about really rushed to make a decision or not want to put a lot of time into it, let's go where we went last time. And that's a great evolutionary strategy if you're trying to find food or something, right? You go the place you went last time. And we're so used to doing that in humans and just going to familiar places. And in a dynamic environment like a mountain snowpack is in winter, the environment's changing a lot more rapidly with what's safe one day might not be safe the next.
I agree. And I think this is my number one biggest weakness is familiarity. I ski a lot of the same places in the backcountry over and over. And, it's like, well, I skied here yesterday. Come on, man. I'm not even going to check. Let's just drop in. And so that's something I've really been trying to check myself with is, okay, hey, even though I know the zone, it doesn't mean it's avalanche safe today, just because it was avalanche safe yesterday. So let's reanalyze it. Let's not be lazy. Let's take in some data and make a decision. So I love that. So that's the F. A might be different, acceptance or sometimes anchoring. And what do you use?
McCammon, and it's his acronym. Okay. 2002, he used acceptance.
Okay, yeah. Great.
But I actually talk about anchoring more, but we'll stick with what McCammon wrote for now. We can circle back to anchoring. So acceptance is basically we want to be accepted, right? We want our partners to like us. We don't want to ruin the group's fun by saying, hey, I don't feel safe here. Let's head elsewhere. And so, it's basically just sort of we want to be accepted. And so we make decisions along those lines, kind of peer pressure, but even if the pressure is not applied by our peers, we apply it to ourselves to not be the person who ruins the trip for everyone.
I think that's great. And this is something I try to be proactive on. A lot of times before a tour, I'll have a quick talk like, hey, if anybody doesn't feel good, we're walking away. And I hope that takes some of that pressure off, that peer pressure. So we're a team. It's not just the one guy, but in the end, it is going to be like, well, Tommy said he didn't like it, so we had to turn around. So I think it's something that we all need to overcome. That, hey, if anybody's not into it, we should probably turn around. I like that. So the third one is the C in facets is consistency.
Yeah, and sometimes this gets labeled as commitment or consistency that we'll see. So, and this is sort of the stick-witedness. This is our goal. And we want to we're committed to that goal, or we want to sort of behave in ways that are consistent with our goals. And this basically is, I think it's at work a lot in a couple of different ways that can get scary. One is checklists that have existed, not necessarily of what to bring on a ski tour, but of what to ski on that ski tour. And certain books out there in the Wasatch and also nationally, and they're great. They're full of great ski lines, but sometimes people are objective oriented and they're in Utah or in Tahoe or in Jackson or in Alaska for a particular week or weekend with the objective to ski that particular shot. And you got to ski the day, right? You can't.
Yep.
Yeah. You just have to be patient with that. And so that's one way I think it's pushing people, particularly into radical terrain, because it's their one chance to ski that. I'm fortunate locally that I can wait till next week or next month or next year, but that's not always the case. And I think that's one way the consistency heuristic can get people.
So that's the C, consistency and commitment. And the fourth letter, E, is experts.
Yeah, or specifically expert halo. And in this case, you sort of feel safer when you're around an expert. That's definitely how my mentoring worked. I was fortunate to have outstanding mentors throughout my sort of skiing career. But when I didn't know that much, I was sort of just getting out. I was relatively late to take an avalanche course. I think nowadays most skiers do it like before their first tour or in their first year. I probably took an avalanche course my fourth year or so of backcountry skiing.
Yeah, me too.
But I was blessed to have outstanding mentors who kept me safe and made good decisions because we never had any avalanche incidents. We were skiing really radical terrain in those, and still are, but in those days. And I just went along with it because they were the experts and went along with their decisions. But it worked out. But I think back to my decision now, why did I feel so safe on lines that are so dangerous? And I think it was because, the expert, the guy who's been skiing this for 20 years, is still here. The guy who knows a lot more than I do.
Right.
So that's the expert halo. And I just feel better about it, not because there's anything about the snow that I know, but the experts trust it. But I think the other way the expert halo flows, and this kind of connects to anchoring, is there's a series of close calls here in the Wasatch 2 years ago now. The forecast of that day had issued a low danger day, a green, completely green avalanche sort of danger rose. And people went crazy.
Yeah, I bet.
Super rad day. And as it was kind of the day that everyone had been waiting for. And I went out, I didn't get out to the afternoon. I was teaching a workshop that morning and got out on the afternoon and quickly immediately noticed the snow cracking under my feet and all that. And it's like, it wasn't really the terrain we were in. We were in really low angle terrain. And the little sloughs weren't going to be a problem. It wasn't steep enough to run, but I wondered, like, this isn't low danger. And it had gotten so windy. I was looking at the ridges and seeing like sort of plumes off the ridges. I'm like, this is at least moderate, right? And it turned out
things
that
are changing.
In the higher terrain, it was far worse. And again, thankfully, there were no fatalities that day, but it was one of those days in the Wasatch I'll remember. And one of it was that, and we had the opportunity to interview some of the people, the persons involved in those slides. And one of the questions I asked was sort of, if the danger had not been low, would you have been there? Would you have skied that? And without any hesitance, they said no, all of them.
Wow.
And I think some of that's that we remain anchored to the forecast.
Yes.
We saw that green, and the anchoring heuristic adjustment used by Kahneman suggests that, people make a decision and they don't change their value much. So they made the decision at 7 a.m, the danger was low. By 3 or 4 p.m., there had been wind loading and other things going on. It was not low, but they didn't update their danger enough. And in some ways, they remain anchored to the forecast. But why wouldn't they? But back to the expert halo, because the expert avalanche forecaster from the excellent Avalanche Forecast Center put that danger out. And they know more than I do.
And that's full circle. And I totally agree with that. And I've seen that happen before. When it's low, people want to really go for it, but you do need to keep taking in information, keep taking in inputs. Because, hey, it's low when they did this at 7 a.m, but now it's windy, it's wind loading, things are changing, but you don't want to. You still want to get that goal. You're still thinking it's a low danger, even though it's totally changed. I think that's a really good one for our listeners to pay attention to. And the fifth one is the T in facets is tracks / scarcity.
I know I've been making local Wasatch references too much, but that's where my experience is. I think about this one all the time as a Wasatch local. Again, a really small mountain range with a whole lot of people in it right now. And tracks are scarce. Fresh tracks are scarce. Even in the backcountry, there are certain places you can always go if you want to walk far enough. But this, I think, has two effects. One, we already talked about, tracks make us feel safer. And sometimes tracks are a good indicator of safety, but when you're dealing with persistent weak layers, like last year, like we were last year, and like we probably will be this year. Who knows? We'll see, but likely. Tracks aren't an indicator. So one is sort of using existing tracks as a sign of safety. The other way this plays into decision-making, I think, is, does it push people into more radical terrain? Because a lot of the sort of go-to safe zones in the Wasatch get skied quite heavily because people know they're safe. And do people opt to ski the slightly higher pitch slope or the slightly more slope because there are fresh tracks there? And so do tracks push people into a level of risk that might be slightly higher than they were planning before the day began?
I think there's no doubt both of those cases are true, because I've done that. I've seen tracks somewhere and thought, oh, well, they've already skied it, so I'm the 5th or 6th guy, so that won't be an issue. And then I've also been pushed into gnarlier terrain because, like, oh man, well, what we planned on skiing is been skied, but that gnarlier line just over there is fresh. I think it's okay. Let's push it. And as you and I know about the Mill Creek avalanche on February 21st, 2020 in the Wasatch Mountains, I think there was already 6 or 7 or 8 tracks before the avalanche went on a hard slab. So
15.
Whoa, okay. I was way done. So 15 tracks before the avalanche was triggered. So tracks are not a sign of safety and really do need to be resistant to, hey, just because the spot you planned on skiing has tracks doesn't mean you should push it into more challenging terrain. So I think those are really great points. And now we'll hit the very last one. The sixth heuristic here in facets is the S, and that's social facilitation.
So social proof. This is what Bruce Tremper, the former director of Utah Avalanche Center and author of the book Staying Alive in Avalanche Terrain, which gets recommended by myself as well.
He's a legend.
Legendary book, legendary director, and great guy. But Bruce refers to this, I believe, in Staying Alive in Avalanche Terrain and other talks as the herding instinct. And we follow where others are. If we don't know where to ski, we go to where the others are going. Or again, this sort of idea of tracks, this kind of overlaps with tracks in my mind a lot, that if there are tracks there, it's going to be safe because other people have skied it.
Right.
And so in both those examples we talked about, it's not the stability of the snow itself. It's using this easy cue. Oh, this track's on a slope. It must be safe. Or, oh, we should go over there because it's fresh. None of that has to do with the snowpack itself, but they're easy ways of making decisions where to ski. And that's the danger. That's where that's a shortcut, but can be a dangerous one.
Well, there's a famous video that we published on Snowbrains not too long ago of somebody who followed tracks, I think in Telluride, and ended up going off like 150-foot cliff. And so, so we do need to be really careful about what we follow because you don't know what those people's experience is or what they're looking for. So slope angle perception, how good or bad are humans at perceiving slope angle in the mountains? And slope angle is huge because, there's certain angles that are way more prone to avalanches and certain angles that are much safer. So how good or bad are humans at perceiving slope angle?
In the mountains, we don't know how bad, and that's the key. And the research in psychology from this, including by colleagues of mine, when I left the University of Utah, I graduated my PhD from there and moved to my new job, which is only a mile and a half away. But Dr. Jean Stefanucci was just arriving. I think but we had overlapped, I think, when she was interviewing her, maybe she got hired the year after. And she's published a lot in this with some of her colleagues from the University of Virginia, our old advisor, Dennis Proffitt, a former colleague, Dr. Sarah Kareem-Regier. And then what their research found is that even on mundane slopes like the hills on a college campus or in a city park, humans were judging 5 and 6 degree slopes to be 15 to 20 degrees, something of that nature. In other words, doubling, tripling the steepness of a slope because there was a bias to just sort of say that humans are judge slopes more steeper than they are. And this probably makes sense evolutionarily. There's probably a good reason we avoid steep slopes, not just to not fall off of them, but because it's more energy to walk uphill. And so to be able to detect subtle differences of the hill and kind of the mind overestimates them. That's probably where these biases come from. Very early evolutionary kind of early perceptual biases that lead into our judgments. When it gets to steeper slopes, I think humans also do that, but partly fear probably factors in too. As skiers, we really like those 40 skiers who love steep slopes, really love those 40-degree slopes, sometimes 50, go bigger. I think for most humans, once a slope gets to 50, 60, they basically suggest that's 90 degrees and they treat it like a 90-degree slope because the reality is in life that is often like a 90-degree slope. If you fall off that, the consequences are the same as the 90-degree slope, in various places,
Yeah, you're not going to stop falling.
And so humans certainly overestimate those kind of slopes. Like they rate at a cliff as being, what we would call a steep ski line.
Right.
The critical point, though, when you mentioned this for avalanche research is what happens around 30 degrees. because you noted in your intro that it matters for avalanche, different types of avalanches. And the type of avalanche that kill most people are hard slab avalanches. And those don't run on slopes less steep than 30 degrees. There's just too much friction, basically. They'll collapse. You'll hear these big collapses of the slab, but they don't move. Wet slides and other kinds of avalanches can do that, but the most deadly form of avalanche, it doesn't slide, and it doesn't avalanche on slopes less than 30 degrees. And so this is a nice decision point to be able to identify if you want to keep it safe, particularly dealing with the snowpack like we were last year in the Wasatch, like they deal with all the time in Colorado, where you have these deep, persistent instabilities that are very difficult to detect. There's a lot of spatial variability, and even a snowpack here might not tell you what's going on in a snowpack 50 meters down the ridge. Even a snowpack doesn't get you feeling good about them. These are the type of avalanches we talked about, that slide when you're the 10th or 12th or 15th or 20th person on the slope, like we saw last year in Utah.
So scary.
And it's very difficult to identify what will and won't slide. It's sort of a low probability it's going to slide, but huge consequences if it does environment. And in my mind, it's the hardest environment to make decisions in. One of the ways around that safely is to not be on slopes over 30 degrees and not to be under slopes greater than 30 degrees. But that means we need to be able to identify what a 30-degree slope is. And more humans are offloading a lot of their good, but not always great decision-making apparatus in their brains to technology, and using things like CalTopo, which is I use it to sort of look at routes and look at particularly what's going to be, I'm in the Tetons or something, what's going to be 1,500 meters above me.
Right.
But there have been problems, been avalanche accidents where, people are trying to sort of fine tune a narrow patch sliver of yellow, which would typically mean under 30 degrees when your settings are set, between these orange zones that are 30 plus degrees.
Right.
And the resolution in CalTopo for that fine of planning, I don't know if I trust it and recommend it. I think it's a great tool. And the other way of accurately measuring slopes, a great way, is to use your inclinometer, right? But that often means you have to get on the slope or really close to it, under it. There are ways of doing it remotely, but as you start doing it more remotely, you lose a little bit you lose some accuracy there. And so it's not always safe to get on the slope to measure it. And so there's going to be some role, I think, for the human eye to be able to estimate slope angle.
And I think the slope angle thing is huge too, because I from what I read, I think that slope angle perception even had a role in that Mill Creek avalanche we talked about that took 4 lives in Utah in February 2021. I think they thought it was a little less steep than it was, but maybe that's what they were using maps, and if it wasn't in that situation, I know it's happened in others. So it
scares me a lot, that accident, for so many reasons. But one of them is the slope angle that slid on, I think, was 31 degrees.
Yes. Okay. That's why. Yeah, it was so close to the cusp.
Yeah. And I that's one of the many things that got me interested in the slope angle perception study. And the other thing I'm interested in is, can we get better at it, and how? And so my colleagues in psychology tell me that surveyors can estimate slopes quite accurately. So can architects. And probably other people who work with it regularly. So is it possible to train and are expert backcountry skiers better at simply judging slopes with their eyes, judging slope angles with their eyes, than novices? And we don't know. And that's one of the many things we're trying to look at with this new study.
Well, that'll be interesting, because it would be great if there was a pathway to figure out how to get better at judging slope angle. But as you're insinuating, it probably is experience, getting out there and finding out. But you also have to check the data, right? Maybe you have to guess and then check it with your inclinometer and see where your guesses lie.
And probably a lot of experience. So it's not the type of thing you pick up in your first ski tour or your first season even. You might be able to get better, certainly, to be able to judge the difference between maybe a 40-degree slope and a 30 and a 30 and a 20. But to get to that 28 versus 31, I don't know what errors were made there. I wasn't there that day, of course, but I don't think there are many skiers who could regularly distinguish between a 30 to 28 and a 31 degree slope, because it's not a straight line like a triangle. Slopes roll, they undulate, they're change a degree or two or 10 here to there. And I don't know. And we're just really interested to see where and how good humans are in this range.
I wanted to jump into confirmation bias. So I thought this concept was extremely interesting, confirmation bias. So can you please tell us about confirmation bias and how it affects us in avalanche terrain?
Yeah, in many ways, I frame this as the seventh heuristic in McCammon's facets collection, or the other C, right? We had anchoring as the other A, and confirmation bias is the other C.
Okay,
but confirmation bias is an interesting theory that I think affects what we do as scientists as well as what we do as in everyday life. So dramatically, because it's a filter on what we pay attention to in the world, or what decisions we make in the world, and particularly we attend to information that confirms our beliefs, our hypotheses, and perhaps our desires. Those are the things we notice, and those are the things we pay attention to, and our expectations. And so if we go out expecting it to be a low danger day, if we go in the backcountry we see all those signs of stability.
Yes.
But it's what we don't see that's the problem. We go out seeking information that confirms our expectations. And I think this works also when it comes to, even if it's not a low danger day, not just confirming an expectation, what we read in the forecast that morning, do we seek information that confirms our desires about what we want the snowpack to be? And everything from sort of having multiple people look at the same snow pit and come up with different observations. That's a fascinating thing, by the way.
Yes, that is.
And does it factor into how hard we tap shovels if we're doing a compression test with a shovel or extended column test? I don't know to go this deep into it, but it's the fact that we see what we want. I've noticed it mostly with me dealing with weather. I don't know exactly how I handle that for avalanche decisions, but I've been in the mountains and seen clouds that looked quite ominous. And seen a storm. And I think some of the biggest mistakes I'm in the mountains have been, maybe not with avalanches, but with weather decisions, and particularly in really remote places. And of course that was a storm coming in, but the weather said it was going to be a clear day. So I'll rely on the weather forecast instead of what's clear to my eyes, or I'll rely on what I want. Of course, I want that just be a cloud to blow over. And how did I not see that? And it's like, I was just looking for information that confirmed what I expected the weather to be from the forecast that morning, or what I wanted it to be.
I do that over and over again. Confirmation bias, I think, I didn't even know about it before, but I instinctually know about it because I do it all the time. I see and experience what I want to see and experience. And then when it's kind of like putting blinders on a horse, right? You're like, oh, I think it's stable and I can ski steep terrain today. So I'm just going to see stability and, clean lines and everything perfect. But, there was a little crack and something over there. Yeah, but it's stable, And so I think that's so interesting. I do this in other things in life too. Like you talked about weather. I do this when I go surfing. I do this when I'm traveling. You see what you want. You try to manifest what you want. So that's another great heuristic. We need to think about, take a step back, continue, kind of like we talked about the low danger. When it was low danger and things were changing, people didn't want to see those changes. They wanted to just focus on, no, it was the forecast said green today. Well, let's all take a step back and remember to take in the new input, take in the new information, and make new decisions. So I want to try something with you. I think this is almost on the fringe of science. It's a little bit in the theoretical realm, but I love this idea that I read when I was learning about you yesterday. It appears that experts do pretty well making decision-making compared to novices, but experts do worse when they're in unusual environments. So environments that differ from what they learned in. Malcolm Gladwell talks about an expert being somebody who's put in 10,000 hours in that realm. So let's say an expert's put in 10,000 hours in the mountains, but now they're in an environment that's different from what they learned in. And I was thinking about how reading about how climate change is kind of making that happen in the mountains. So we have more extreme events. Things are warmer. Things are really changing fast in the mountains. So I think it's going to be really interesting moving forward. I'm curious your thoughts on it. So I'm a mountain expert, let's say. Oh, I know about mountains and I get out there, but now with climate change, things are so different. We might not have, true experts on the mountains moving forward because things are going to be so dynamic potentially.
One of my mentors and good friends fought fire. He's retired now, but fought wildland fire for his long career in the BLM and probably other agencies. And he and I were talking, I was probably talking in the context of snowpack, but he said, I'm glad I've retired from the fire game now. The past doesn't predict the present. And I feel much less, implying he feels much less confident relying on those, for him, 20 plus years of maybe 30 years of firefighting experience to deal with what they're presently doing with wildfires right now. And I think the same thing exists in the snow and avalanche world, where even 50-year models aren't that predictive now. I mean, Little Cottonwood Canyon has had two 50-year avalanche cycles in the last 3 years, right?
Yeah.
And so suddenly what these 50-year anomalies aren't abnormal anymore. And it's a different environment. And I think that speaks a lot to, we can't just rely on what used to work in our systems, and we need to update our systems and making decisions, because it's a different environment out there, both socially. A lot more skiers out there. I've done things differently in terms of where there are places I just don't go anymore on crowded weekend days, not just because of fresh tracks, but there's too many skiers above me.
Right.
Too many parties. And we saw that last year in Utah with the Wilson Glade accident, where it involved two separate parties. One that didn't even know the other was there,
right,
until they were doing a transceiver beacon search, and
terrifying.
Yeah, so the social environment has changed so much, and that changes decision making. And yeah, the climate has changed so much. The snowpack is different every year. I don't want to say but the extremes of that are more common now. And yeah, it's wild. I don't know. We have to treat every year like our first year in the range right now.
I think so. I think that anybody who is, thinking they wear the expert hat needs to take a step back and really look at what's happening, because like you said, things are just these extremes, and these really, which used to be rare events, are happening frequently now. And so, yeah, it's a tricky situation where it doesn't matter who you are. Nobody's an expert in this modern age. So let's hit something that I think is close to your heart, is high altitude effects on decision-making. So this is something that I think you've been studying intensely, the effects of high altitude on the brain, and specifically on decision-making. So what are the effects of high altitude on the brain?
Oh, well, they make the brain worse.
Yeah, I bet.
We know, particularly from accounts of high altitude mountaineers, that their brains change, their thought goes downhill, memory is impacted, attention is surely impacted. I can tell you that from my own experience in high altitude. Perhaps even perception is impacted. Certainly decision making is going to be impacted. And the physiological reason why I think it's pretty safe to assume is why it happens is that, in higher altitude, there's less pressure in the air such that you get less oxygen per breath. So there's not, and that would mean there's less oxygen in the lungs, why hiking is so much harder at high elevation, and any kind of physical activity is. And that's why sleeping is harder too. And so as there's less and less oxygen in the air, there's less and less oxygen, less pressure in the air, there's less oxygen in the lungs. That's going to mean there's less oxygen going to the brain. We talked earlier about how the brain uses 20 to 25% of the body's oxygen. And if there's less there, certainly the brain's going to change. And getting into specifics of how exactly and why, and we're not there yet. We're just starting to get that data, but that's what I'm working on at altitude right now.
Well, that's fascinating. I'm excited to learn what you learn once you guys get to the publication phase. But it's clear that altitude does make us worse at decision making. And I am curious, what do you guys consider? What's the threshold for high altitude? The type of altitude that could affect your brain?
It's a good question. Like most good questions, it's hard one to answer. And like most things involving humans, it's very difficult to answer because it depends on where you're starting from. If you live in Seattle, at sea level, and fly to Colorado, you can start to certainly see altitude sickness as low as 8, 10, maybe 10,000 feet. Maybe I'll say 10, 12. I think I'd have to look this up. Airplane cockpits are pressurized to about 8,000 feet of elevation.
That's what I read.
I think so. Yeah. I'm just spitting off memory. So we read the same stuff. Whether it's right or wrong, we don't know.
Yeah.
But
that's what I've heard.
So that's the base of, snowbird skier. It's pretty high up. And so I'm assuming that means the brain is pretty okay for a few hours at 8,000. But I know people who actually ski patrollers who work at 10,000 feet, for example, in New Mexico. And, people who drive up from Dallas to go skiing in a day, rally that road trip across, Highway 40, and go from basically sea level in Dallas to 8,000 feet in Santa Fe and 9, maybe 10,000 feet in peaks above there are feeling the symptoms. And so depending where you're coming from, but if you live I live in Salt Lake Valley, I live at 4,400 feet, your brain's going to be adapted. I probably start feeling elevation at about 13,000 feet myself. And it's going to depend on where you live and where your base elevation is.
So it is esoteric and does kind of depend on the person. But that's what I've heard. Somewhere around 8,000 feet could be the threshold. I know as a kid, I went up and got really sick around 8,000 feet in the California Sierra Mountains. So yeah, so interesting that it's tough to define those kind of things. That's for sure. So this is kind of the last question, and I don't think there's a clinical answer. I'm kind of curious on your opinion. So high risk behavior in human beings. Why do you think humans are so attracted to high risk behaviors, especially in the mountains? Why do we climb high and risk life and limb in avalanche terrain to ski and ride? Why do you think we do that stuff?
Well, the short version of why humans take risks is it can be a lot of fun. And I think you and I are both people. I've never skied with you, but from what I know, and we both sought risk in the mountains on skis and otherwise, and because it is fun. And for me, more and more, that's changing to the people I meet along the way, and the relationships I have, in addition to just the experiences I have from my mountain partners who I love, and so that's part of it. The communities we build, but there is a attraction and a pleasure in risk taking and the experience of adrenaline, and if we want to break this down to the neurotransmitter of dopamine.
Yes.
And it's a rush and it's enjoyable. And as humans and as most organisms, we go back and do things that felt great. And I think there's some of that in risk taking. There's also a social component to it where it does elevate status. If you look toward mountaineers, and if you look at, the French team that climbed Annapurna, the first 8,000 meter ascent, they went back to their communities with great accolades, and there's some social signaling value to it, I suppose, as well.
They were gods when they came home.
Yeah. And we all want to be gods, right? And even if we're not, if you can't be the first human to ascend an 8,000 meter peak, because they've all been done, that's off the table. That God feeling, I don't know what it's like to be a God or feel like one, or what a God is even, but that feeling we get at altitude and at elevation, particularly as the sun is rising or setting and you're clicking on skis to ski powder. I don't know if I can explain why, but it's so obvious that that's worth the risk, which is what makes it difficult to dial back that risk just a little bit at the right time, or to not take it at the wrong time, because we're always walking that line. And we know that line exists somewhere. But we're always kind of right there. What can we get away with? And that's such a dangerous place to be as a human, because we've all pushed it just a little too far. And most of us think we're able to walk away from that.
Well, the last question is, what's next for you? What's next for you in your life's journey?
Well, life's journey starts at tomorrow, and I have no idea what tomorrow is going to bring. I have a 9:00 meeting, and who knows what happens. But one of the reasons I like to not be in indoor meetings and be outside is those are the experiences that kind of really motivate me to keep going and to keep working on new projects, both and stay fit and all that. So my next big mountain project, I'm heading to Ecuador.
Oh, wow.
New Year's Eve. Yeah. Heading out down there on New Year's Eve, and I'm going to hopefully collect some more high altitude data, although most of it's just still kind of testing equipment to see if setups work and to see if these could potentially work as as future high altitude research sites. But of course, we're down there and I'm flying all the way to Ecuador. I might as well bring skis and do some skiing and mountaineering.
I hope so.
Who knows what the snow conditions hold, but I think the conditions of the mountain will at least be enough to get some good climbing in on crampons. So yeah, that's my next mountain trip.
Well, I wish you all the best with that project and that mountain trip. Russ, it was great talking to you. I appreciate you. Thank you very, very much for being here. Have a great rest of the day, man.
Thanks, Miles.
Thank you so much for listening to the Snowbrains podcast. If you liked this podcast, please share with your friends and family, and please subscribe. To find out more about Snowbrains, please visit us at snowbrains.com. You can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Snowbrains. Today's Snowbrains podcast is brought to you by Grand Targhee Resort. With over 20 feet of snowfall to date, heading to the Tetons is a must-do. We invite you to experience and be part of the Targhee vibe at Grand Targhee Resort. This episode of the Snowbrains podcast was edited by Jared White, music by Chad Crouch, and I'm your host, producer, and creator, Miles Clark.